Mid-1800s European nationalism kicks off with what some view as the first modern warfare. They call it this because of the new technological changes that had happened in many of the countries that are involved. The Crimean War, which really only lasts about 2 years, happens initially with the dispute over who controls certain holy places. Russia had begun to occupy more and more principalities of the Ottoman Empire because they had helped other parts of Europe with their revolutions, so they kind of figured, well, then we should just be able to take more of this over and not have a problem. Previous to the war, the Crimean Peninsula had, well, and even after the war, had numerous different holy sites within its locale, and up until the 1850s, France had protected the Catholic sites in the Ottoman Empire, and Russia had protected the Eastern Orthodox sites. So basically you had Russia and France essentially protecting Christian locations, even though, of course, the Muslim-led empire was overseeing the whole area. What happens basically is that the Ottoman Empire, Great Britain, France, and Piedmont Sardinia get together to prevent Russia from creeping even further west into the continent of Europe. Napoleon III of France tried to force the Ottomans to recognize France as its sovereign authority in this particular area, particularly some of the Holy Land locations that Russia had protected, and Russia disagreed with this. So ultimately, it's a conflict over land, but it really goes back to a conflict over who controls religious sites. On this particular map, you can see where the conflict occurs in the Crimean Peninsula, and obviously it's closest to Russia, so they're fairly able to get down there in time. In fact, they're able to actually send in their naval forces. The biggest battle of this happens to be Sevastopol in 1854 into 55, and then there's a rather significant naval battle that occurs in Balaclava that involves Turkish troops and eventually the British and French troops, and of course some Russian support as well. I don't know how many of you are fans of the poet Tennyson, but his poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, you might have heard reference to, especially if you've ever seen the movie The Blind Side. This is the poem that they read kind of toward the end, but it does actually reference a battle during Balaclava that actually happens on land, and so if you've ever heard it referenced, it actually refers to the Crimean War. So kind of an interesting little side note. Another element of this war that's kind of unique is the emergence of modern-day nursing, particularly on the battlefront. And you probably heard of Florence Nightingale before, but she really is kind of the embodiment of modern nursing in regards to medical care on the war front. And she was kind of known, quote-unquote, as the lady with the lamp. She would walk amongst the injured in kind of rudimentary military hospitals. This is really the first time that they're kind of setting up things like this and bringing in women to start to treat the injured. Even though you don't hear much about the Crimean War, it certainly had a rather significant impact on the countries that were involved. You have almost 500,000 men killed in battle or from their wounds, 2/3 of which were Russian. Of the 2/3 that die, 2/3 of them are actually, those deaths are attributed to sickness and not actually injuries on the battlefront. Florence Nightingale is also known for starting to recognize and push for the importance of cleanliness and disease, and certainly we are continuing in the 1800s to try to combat the spread of diseases amongst the soldiers, which, as we know, is causing more deaths than anything. At the end of the war in 1856, you have yet another Treaty of Paris being signed. I'm not sure how many this gets us to, or will get us to. I think there's probably 7 Treaty of Parises, last I checked. At any rate, the end result was that Russia and the Ottoman naval forces were not allowed to exist on the Black Sea. All the major powers that were involved in this conflict agreed to, quote-unquote, respect the political integrity of the Ottoman Empire. But keep in mind, this is the mid-1800s, and by, of course, 1920, the Ottoman Empire will cease to exist. So who really benefits and who loses big? For the most part, technology is the one that benefits, and the countries that have a lot of this industrial complex put into place start to emerge as the victors. It's a bit of a blow, obviously, to the Russians. Probably the biggest loss is for the Ottoman Turks because they're essentially on the way out. If you want to look at one other benefit of the Crimean War, it is certainly that the emergence of nationalism is becoming more and more a prominent feature of countries around Europe. And this push for nationalism has another kind of consequence that for the most part is good, and that is that the push for nationalism ultimately pushes for some of these countries in Europe who are not unified to become unified. And so the first one we look at is Italian unification. Italian unification is going to be led by 4 major Italian nationalist leaders. You have Count Cavour on the left there, who was known kind of as the head, if you will, of the operations. He was the prime minister of Italy, or of the Italian states rather, and he really wanted a resurgence of Italy for Italians and making it a strong unified Italian front, not an area that's gobbled up and split up by many different parts of Europe. Giuseppe Garibaldi is known as the Sword. He was actually a hired mercenary. That was kind of his career. In fact, it's supposedly, as the tale goes, he had actually spent quite a bit of his formative years as a hired mercenary in various Latin American countries during revolutions, and that's supposedly where he met his wife, who had kind of also been caught up in revolutionary fervor. And he's going to do quite a bit to lead kind of the military component of the push for nationalism. Giuseppe Mazzini is known as the Heart. He's really the heart and soul behind the movement as far as getting the message out and promoting Italian nationalism in the press and kind of in speeches and whatnot. And then the king at this time is King Victor Emmanuel II. He's the king, if you remember, of the Piedmont Sardinia area, and ultimately he will become the king of a unified Italy. Of course, another key component of Italian unification is getting the church to be on board, and the Pope at this time is Pope Pius IX, and he will certainly play an important role in trying to protect the image of the church and the power of the church, but also to support unification if it's going to happen, but make sure that the church is still an important part of a newly found Italy. The Sardinia-Piedmont kingdoms that were formed in 1815 after the Congress of Vienna are really going to be known as kind of the magnet for unification, and that's actually what the heading says. I don't know if you can see that behind the map. It'll show up better on yours. But this period of Italian unification is known as Risorgimento, which kicks off kind of once the Congress of Vienna can, I guess, goes into recession, if you will. The full aspect of the movement really begins in the 1820s, but if you're looking at where the heart of this movement comes from, it's from this kingdom. The first step to this movement actually begins in the 1820s and 21s when you have the Carbonari insurrections, and these were secret societies of revolutionaries that were formed. You can see the couple examples right there of them being arrested. Their nicknames were actually the Coalmen because they used charcoal to mark new members' heads kind of as an initiation process. The second step behind unification involves Piedmont Sardinia sending troops to the Crimean Peninsula during the war. This is essentially their kind of introduction, if you will, to the European powers that be, and gives them also a chance to make a military presence to kind of show the rest of Europe that they're serious about becoming a major power in Europe. In step 3, you have Count Cavour meeting with, at the time, of course, king slash president slash monarchical leader, whatever you want to call him, Napoleon III. And they actually meet in 1858 eventually. That's where this picture is from. But they had met essentially to get support or form an alliance system. Cavour wants Napoleon to promise French troop protection if Austria attacks them. And one of the issues that Cavour has to deal with and other leaders in the Italian nationalist movement is that they're going to have to try to get land away from areas like Austria that controlled some of the Italian states. And they're concerned that as they try to do that, certainly you're going to have war break out, which is precisely what happens in the next step. So in step 4, you have the Austro-Sardinian War of 1859. In April 29th of that year, Austria actually invades the Piedmont Kingdom, and France, like Count Cavour was hoping, France actually comes to the rescue and backs them up with troops. When this war is all said and done, you have basically Austria losing some land. The Piedmont Sardinian Kingdom gets Lombardy, but they lose but they don't get Venetia, which is also something they obviously wanted as part of their Italian states. In step 5, you have the Italians kind of on the outside watching this situation unfold in 1866. So notice, this is a bit of a gap. We go from 1859 to 1866. In this particular war, you have a kingdom of Italy that has kind of been rudimentarily formed by 1861, if you look at the map in green there, but they still are wanting some territories from other locations. So in this particular one, they are trying to get control of Venetia, and this really pits actually Austria and Prussia against each other. And so the Italians help out Prussia because they know that if Prussia can win in exchange, they will get Venetia back. And that's exactly what happens. So Austria loses control of Venetia, and then Venetia is annexed to Italy. And of course, Italy has to give Prussia some things on the side, but it's always going to be to Prussia's advantage at this point to try to weaken Austria and certainly the size of Austria. So they were more than willing to have Austria lose land. In step 6, you have Giuseppe Garibaldi and his quote-unquote red shirts, his mercenary group, uniting with Count Cavour. And what they actually did, and it's kind of funny because these two guys don't like each other, but they believed in unification so much that they were willing to work for it. And so what you guys notice, if you kind of look at this map, and I'll see if I can do this fun little arrow thing. Maybe not. They basically try to go through the bottom. Look at it. I kind of drew on it. They basically try to go from Sicily up through the bottom of the Italian boot and try to convince any outlying villages that are not ready for unification to be ready for unification. And they at times have to use military force to really get the message across that Italy is going to be unified. You know, get out of the way if you don't want to be part of it, but the time has come. And so they're kind of going through the bottom of Italy to try to really build up this nationalist fervor. And then we get to the final piece of it, and that's step 7. And this occurs when basically you have the French troops leaving Rome. Look at, there's Rome. Oh, look at me use this arrow. Woo. You have French troops leaving Rome in 1870, and certainly France had kind of protected the Papal States. The church had asked them to do that. It had kind of been overseen by France, and France agrees by 1870 to leave, and thus you get officially a united Italy in 1870, finally. And then here's a fun little cartoon with Giuseppe Garibaldi helping the new king of Italy put on the Italian boot. Get it? It's clever. And now we move to the next unification piece, and it's a big one, and that's German unification. We know that steps to unify the area had begun already in 1834 when you had the Germans' custom union designed that was supposed to help boost the economies of all the states in the German Confederation. We know that ultimately how this worked is that they removed internal customs barriers and therefore opened up trade much easier and hopefully economic growth within this designated region. We also know that one of the biggest problems that this location had to deal with throughout the 1800s was the rivalry between Prussia and Austria. Austria had not been included in the Zollverein customs union, and they had tried to actually lure South Germany away at one point and tried to get them to be in their little empire. So Austria and Prussia really have some issues. It's very much a love-hate relationship, and at times they've worked together, but as you get into the 1800s, more and more they are working against each other. Now we look at the key players of this unification. For Prussia, it will be, well, he was William I, and he was a Hohenzollern king of Prussia, so he's from the Hohenzollern family. So he's king of Prussia before unification. When unification goes through, he will become the first Kaiser of Germany, and we know him as Kaiser Wilhelm I. Helmut von Moltke will be the German chief of staff throughout unification. And then finally we get to everyone's favorite, well, maybe not everyone's, but the very important Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who in these 3 different pictures kind of shows you 3 different elements. He was labeled as a realpolitik, which means that he was a politician that believed in tough-minded realism that actually aimed at strengthening a state, tightening social order, you could certainly say that he was much more of a conservative leader in nature. His main goal throughout his kind of